And he says, overall, early Pentecostals couldn't agree whether Christian unity was a good thing to be pursued or if it was a false illusion. In other words, that, this is just something that the devil's disguising us to, compromise the true gospel. But overall, he does say that there was a bend towards ecumenism. And that's across the board, not just in any particular denomination. He finds, and he surveys different people from the Pentecostal Holiness Church, the Assemblies of God, Church of God, and so forth, and he finds that there are some people in this time period who are for ecumenism, some who are open to it, and then some who are just plain against it. And I'll just highlight a few people who were for unity. For example, some person who I've never heard of, but David Wesley Myland said that he longing for Christian unity was a sign of the baptism in the Holy Spirit. So he's out there saying we need to have Christian unity. Then there were some who were kind of moderate and said that unity was a part of the Pentecostal faith, but perhaps it shouldn't be, pursued at all costs, and that perhaps there's more important concerns than unity. Perhaps truth. So someone like William Seymour, he encouraged and respected all Christians, and but he still kind of said there's some divisions that are worth having, but he still wanted to be open to others. And so, for example, he would welcome non-Pentecostals to his congregation, and in one particular edition of the Apostolic Faith, he wrote, "We have to recognize every man that honors the blood. So let us seek peace and not confusion. We that have the truth should handle it carefully. The moment we feel we have all the truth, or more than anyone else, we will drop. We must deal patiently with the Lord's people." And there's some other people that Jacobson mentions who seem to be open to ecumenism and Christian unity. This isn't in that article, but Amy Semple McPherson, at least before she starts the International Foursquare Church denomination, when she was going around preaching, she didn't encourage Christians to just join a Pentecostal church. She encouraged them to remain in whatever church was Christian. Or if they were part of a church, stay in that church. Or if they weren't a Christian, just go to a church. It didn't matter. It didn't have to be a Pentecostal church. And so some people said that she was well before her time as far as being open to ecumenism. But there were opponents of ecumenism as well. Like William Durham. We mentioned he was a rather fiery person and liked to call people devils. And so you have some people like William Durham who were like, we are in an eschatological battle. This is the last days. Make sure you're on the right side of the battle. And so he basically said, there's so much spiritual lukewarmness in the churches that we need to oppose them, and we need to be opposed to error. So it's all about truth, and we're right and they're wrong, and so why would we compromise? And there's some other people that are mentioned too. But that's just to give a bit of an example that you did have some early Pentecostals who were all in favor, some who were kind of on the fence, and some who were against it. But this is what I found the most important part in that particular article was when he talks about context, the context of early Pentecostalism. He says we have to remember that this movement for renewal, this Pentecostal movement, was largely being rejected by the churches. And a lot of Pentecostals were being accused of being demon-possessed and crazy or just plain stupid even. And so these Pentecostals are in a hostile environment, and he says it's actually impressive that they were open to any kind of ecumenism when they're being shunned by so many people. And let me just read a quote from Douglas Jacobson here. He says, "The fact that Pentecostals could speak of Christian unity at all in this context of heated exchange and boundary marking is nothing less than remarkable." And then when I read that, I was like, wow, that's a really good observation. When we always have to consider the context that people are in. And so he says overall that the ecumenical movement is not out of sync with the origins of the Pentecostal movement. And as I said, even though there were some who were clearly against ecumenism, he says overall it does seem that the early, and I say to the 1940s because those are the groups of people that he's mentioning in his work, that overall there does seem to be a bend towards ecumenism and being open to being united with other churches and dialoguing with them, working with them, and so forth. Then I'd say in the 40s you have what might be called early Pentecostal ecumenism, and I put ecumenism in brackets because it's not really the whole church. It's more so just Pentecostals working towards Pentecostal unity. So even though you have numerous denominations, you have numerous Pentecostal denominations joining together to join the North American Association of Evangelicals. I think that's what NAE stands for, yeah. From 1943 onwards, so now they're becoming united with other evangelical denominations. In 1947, you have the Pentecostal World Conference, where you now have a meeting of Pentecostals from around the world working together in unity. You have similar things happening in other churches during this time period too, where you have Baptist World Conference and other conferences and things. So they weren't unique in this, but Pentecostal Fellowship of North America also happening. But really, ecumenism usually refers to the whole church and being, not just with other Pentecostals and not even just with other evangelicals, but am I willing to also have fellowship and be a part of an organization with Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, and God forbid, even the liberal Anglicans, or, not that all Anglicans are liberal, or Presbyterians, or people from the United Church of Canada. I know. And so that's why evangelicals and Pentecostals, as I said, were, at least in North America, primarily evangelical, were hesitant to affirm the World Council of Churches because they viewed it as a very liberal movement, as a place of having to compromise the gospel. And so the World Council of Churches is formed in 1948, and at this time, the Pentecostal denominations, here I'll speak specifically of the Assemblies of God, was antagonistic to the World Council of Churches. And David du Plessis is always the example that comes up when people talk about ecumenism. David du Plessis was a South African who had come to the United States in 1948. He was ecumenically minded. He was actually the one who organized in 1947 the Pentecostal World Conference. And so he comes to the States a year later and he takes his credentials with the Assemblies of God. But in 1951, he contacts the National Council of Churches, which was basically an American form of ecumenism. So instead of the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches was ecumenism in the States. And he makes friends with people there, and he's actually invited to be a part of the World Council of Churches in 1954. And to show a sign of how many connections he had in the world of ecumenism, in the 1960s, when Vatican II was happening in Rome, he was the only accredited Pentecostal observer, the only one who was invited. And this Vatican II, remember, this is a Roman Catholic council, but he was invited to take part of it. But the Assemblies of God weren't too happy with all of his ecumenical friends and so forth. Again, they were suspicious, as were other evangelicals, suspicious of liberalism. And so 1962 to 1980 are the years that he lost his credentials with the Assemblies of God. Some people say they were taken away from him. Another place I read that he resigned from the Assemblies of God in 1962. But eventually restrictions from the denomination with respect to ecumenical involvement, they weren't as strict anymore, and so he was able to get his credentials reinstated in 1980. He's kind of the case study that everybody thinks about to show how Assemblies of God attitudes towards ecumenism have shifted and how they weren't so good at one point in time.